So there's the worst case for you. The other lenders that didn't pass have got a couple of weeks to put together a plan and then implement it in the next 9 months, or somehow plug those capital holes. Time now to pull apart those test results with our expert from the German Institute for Economic Research, Kerstin Bernoth. Thank you very much for coming in. First of all, let's start with the tests themselves, though, the criteria. Tough enough?
Tougher than in the test that they performed before, but not. I wouldn't say that they were too tough.
Would you go as far as saying or calling them a farce? Because some people have. They've called them a farce. They've said that they deeply understate the risk of deflation. They also deeply understate the debt leverage that could be used in a crisis.
I wouldn't go so far.
No.
But I would say that they only actually modeled a scenario of a mild recession.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually neglected a lot of risk, like the deflationary risks. But it's always the problem when you have scenario analysis that you have to, you cannot test for all scenarios.
But when you say a mild recession, what are we going into at the moment in the bloc?
I think we have a major recession. Yeah. For example, in the stress test, they assume a fall of GDP by 1.6%. But we observed in the last few years a drop in GDP, which was much bigger. Because
let me point out, the ECB's argument was that deflation was not included in this test because deflation's not going to happen. And I mean, the eurozone, at least the periphery, is already in deflation, isn't it?
Yes, but the ECB is, of course, looking at the average, at the European average inflation ratio. And there we are not yet in a deflation, although we see there's some risk. But we are not in a deflation yet.
And what are the biggest risks that have resulted from this test?
The
biggest risks that we have to look out for or worry about?
So we have to worry, of course, about the huge amount of non-performing loans that the ECB discovered on the bank balance sheets. That a couple of banks, 25 banks were originally last year were undercapitalized. That's, of course, a risk that we have to take serious.
Okay, so the test has achieved something. It's pointed out things that the lenders need to do. They need to bolster their capital reserves. But now that a lot of them have enough buffer there, why are they not lending to businesses that actually need that credit?
So the problem is, do we have a credit supply problem or credit demand problem? And I would say clearly it's both. So in the crisis countries, but even if the banks have the ability to give credit to the corporate sector in the crisis countries, they are maybe not willing because the economic situation is too weak, default risks are too high, and so to speak, I would say that the stress test is not necessarily the solution to boost credit growth.
What does that do to trust? Trust in the banks, trust in the bloc?
I would say that the stress test was important to improve credibility and trust in the markets, but we should necessarily still be careful. A couple of years ago, everybody said the banking sector is resilient, and a couple of months later, we were in the deepest banking crisis we have ever seen. And
just very briefly, we heard about the Austrian lender winding up. Is that the only option if the bank can't find enough capital, if it can't merge or take on state help?
Yes.
So basically, if that is the only option, then, and one of the only other ones is taking on state help, that involves the taxpayer again. The taxpayer is roped in again, and I thought that that's what we were trying to avoid in all of this.
Yes, and that's where we currently work on, that we try to establish a single resolution mechanism on the European level, that to avoid exactly that the taxpayer always has to step in and not the creditors or the debt holders.
Okay, well, we'll see if we can achieve that. Kerstin Bernoth, thank you very much for the insight.